the day of the killing of Malcolm X, the assassination of Malcolm X. I mean, when I'm reading that chapter, it almost tells me that Malcolm knew that it's coming very close.
Malcolm was the Nation of Islam. He was that iconic image. And of course, there was some jealousy within the higher elites of that community because Malcolm had more exposure than Elijah Muhammad.
Around the dinner table, you're not discussing football or entertainment. You're discussing how do we change this world?
How to make the world better. But once Malcolm started engaging in international affairs, now the memo had to be forwarded to the CIA so they could keep a minute-to-minute track on Malcolm's affairs. And that's why Malcolm said that the attempt on his life was greater or larger than the nation, just the Nation of Islam. So he saw other rings of evil surrounding him with an invested interest to remove him. As he said numerous times, I'm not a racist, I'm not a racist, I'm not a black nationalist, I'm not a Pan-Africanist, I am a Muslim.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Dear brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, and welcome to Islamic OASIS Live. This is the second episode, inshallah, that we are presenting to you, bi'iznillahi ta'ala, on the book, Why Was Malcolm Really Killed? With our dear brother, Sheikh Muhammed Jaaber. Many of you saw the first one. SubhanAllah, it seems like there are people still watching it. There's a lot of comments underneath that episode from different communities trying to figure out how exactly, what was the role of Malcolm X? What happened to, what does it mean, the assassination of Malcolm X? And a personality of Malcolm X, the role of NOI, meaning Nation of Islam. I saw a lot of comments from ex-members of NOI and those who came into Islam. And obviously some people actually wrote, like 10 paragraphs explaining every point that Sheikh was saying or where they disagreed or they agreed. So it was a very interesting episode. Seems like it hit a lot of nerve, but at the same time, it did a lot of clarification for a lot of people. And at the same time, actually, we had amazing comments, both here in Chicago, brothers here who are still listening. There are people, because the longest episodes of people are listening half an hour, then an hour. That's usually how it works. And then we had, a lot of good comments regarding the role of the ulama and how celebrity ulama are created, how they are pushed in a certain way in the communities and what happens today with the role of technology and in the past. With literally giving certain people platform and removing when needed. So all of that was that first episode. This second episode gets a little bit more sensitive in some ways, meaning because we're actually discussing the last two chapters regarding the circumstances surrounding the day of the assassination, and also what and who may and may not be involved. And at the same time, the real reasons for why an assassination actually occurred. What was the reason? Why was Malcolm becoming so, problematic for powers that be, that they had to make sure that his voice is completely, they wanted to silence him in every way possible. So inshallah, to discuss this episode, this part of the book, we brought obviously the Sheikh back. So Sheikh, are you ready for this, inshallah?
Yes, inshallah.
Inshallah, Rabbil Alameen. So let's begin with this this part here, Sheikh. First of all, your understanding of what happened. I mean, because chapter 13 talks about, in this book, a total of 14 chapters, maybe 14, 15 chapters. And then you talk about, actually, no, let's go to the 15th, then we'll come back to 14, because first, the reasons. Malcolm is now traveling around the world. He's been to Sudan. He loves Sudan. He's meeting with people in, the leadership from Guinea, from Lebanon, from Egypt, he's visited Makkah, Medina. And there is this discussion that, let's say, there is this idea that, there's apartheid, which is taking place in South Africa. And United Nations is taking stance against it and whatever that means, because we know what United Nations really is. And then, so there is that discussion within the US that if it's apartheid in South Africa, how is it that when you have 22 million blacks in this country are being segregated, and there's Jim Crow laws, there's all kinds of things that are happening. So tell me, Sheikh, what happens here? What is happening to Malcolm X while he's traveling, and his influence not only in the US, but outside the US?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. When we look at Malcolm X, when he was domesticated, speaking, representing the Nation of Islam, there was no international oversight over his actions or his behavior. It was only in 1964 when Haj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, traveled abroad. That's when a international concern was attached to him. So there was a different profile created for him once he actually defected from the Nation of Islam. Okay, meaning that now there were Richard Helms, which was the director of the CIA at that particular time, was assigned to Malcolm X abroad. Okay, one of the major highlights that occurred was when Malcolm was denied entry into France. And that was a great concern of Malcolm. And actually, Malcolm had planned to return to France or do a protest in front of the French embassy or consulate, expressing his grievance and why they rejected him. So that became a major concern. So now you have the Malcolm X profile with J. Edgar Hoover monitoring him as a Black extremist movement inside of America. And now he's been assigned a CIA agent to monitor all of his actions. So now Malcolm becomes an international threat. He had the access to the podium at the United African Summit, United Organization of Africa. It was actually a coalition of African states to bring about some form of unity, to strengthen their alliance in regards to decolonization. So Malcolm had a window there. And of course, as you mentioned, he used the apartheid scenario that was condemned by the United Nations as an entry point to get the attention of the people. And that really was contemplated by the African states. Of course, now you have Malcolm aggravating and agitating the African states, causing them to rethink their alliance with the so-called democracy that they was actually selling or actually presenting to those African states. So, of course, no one wanted Malcolm to get involved in that. Number two is that it was so serious that J. Edgar Hoover was contemplating applying the Logan Act to Malcolm, meaning that when an unauthorized citizen speaks ill abroad of some of the international foreign policies against the country. So they just really wanted to stop his actions inside of the African country and abroad. So that was one reason that Malcolm wanted to, the people wanted Malcolm to be silenced. And of course, silence in that language means removed and possibly killed.
Sheikh, when it comes to France, why exactly not allowing, he's not allowed to enter France? Is that because France itself was France has been involved in colonialization since, its inception, to be honest. And, what they were doing in Algeria, the killing of 4 million Muslims there. So was Malcolm issue just or for the United States or the West in general? Because he was exposing the hypocrisy in general.
Yes. But France was one of the softest countries that they had a different agenda for foreign presence. And so Malcolm was really concerned about France rejecting him because he thought France, it was actually mind-boggling because he thought France would be the last country that would reject him. But what happened later, we come to understand that there was a memo that actually got into the wrong hands that indicated that the CIA had attempted to assassinate Malcolm in France. So France had that information, so they didn't want Malcolm killed on their soil. They never shared that information. It's something that came out later. So just the fact that they had a heads up that Malcolm was to be assassinated in France, that's one of the reasons why they prohibited him or forbidden him from entering the country.
Sheikh, there's a part in the book that he talks about having to go to a hospital in emergency because of that he thought his thing was that they may be even trying to poison him on the trip internationally when he was, because there's one part you talk about him, he had to end up in the hospital. I think that's the day or two before he was supposed to speak at either correct me if I'm wrong, either at the African Unity Conference or so he was supposed to speak there. So they were trying to make sure that he doesn't get there, although he still did get there.
Yes, he did. What happened is that it was actually after a meal that Malcolm was poisoned, and of course, if he had not gotten to the hospital at the proper time, then of course he would have died. But it was able to pump his stomach and get him cleaned up and so forth and so on. And of course, he was able to speak. Also, when Malcolm was returning from abroad, he stopped in Ethiopia. Mm. And of course, he refused a meal there because they had offered him a meal in Ethiopia. So Malcolm refused that meal. Malcolm was very inquisitive, and he knew that there was a shadow of evil that was hovering over him. So he took all necessary precautions, all the way down to food after he learned his lesson in Egypt. And that's why Malcolm said that the attempt on his life was greater or larger than the nation of Islam. So he saw other rings of evil surrounding him with an invested interest to remove him.
Sheikh, so subhanAllah, and then just before I go on to the next, you said before he was domesticated. I mean, what does that mean? Because domesticated meaning that, let's connect that to the reality of many people in this country. I mean, a lot of people they think United States is the world. They've never been outside the United States. They don't know what the world looks like. They don't understand the realities of how big this world is and what's happening in this world. How important is it, Sheikh, for somebody like Malcolm to actually travel? Well, it's amazing to see that that a person like this or people with that kind of qualities in general are not domesticated. Let's put it this
way. When I say Malcolm was domesticated, meaning that he was actually promoting a structured agenda. And of course, that agenda was controlled. It was a Black nationalist agenda. And of course, much of the information about what was happening on the interior of America, even African states who had embassies and consulates, they were just isolated on 2 or 3 streets in America. They never had the opportunity to actually interact with urban America, the grassroots. So they was actually very uninformed about what was actually going on in America. And we have to realize as well that the Nation of Islam was just a domestic Black nationalist movement that had no international affiliations whatsoever. So Malcolm, he was actually operating what we could say in isolation in regards to his new an agenda of international relations. So there was no need, or it was not necessary to have the CIA involved in investigating Malcolm's travels. In fact, when Malcolm traveled abroad, as we know, the FBI had already began to surveil Malcolm as he was in the Nation of Islam, as he was advocating that agenda. And also when he actually established his own organization, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and the Organization for Afro-American Unity. In New York. So what happened is that, so once Malcolm actually traveled abroad, that created a whole new Malcolm, a whole new experience. So what happened is the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, would send to the CIA director, Richard Helms, Malcolm's memo. his travels and things that he had, because it was the FBI that was actually surveilling him and monitoring all of his travels prior. But once Malcolm started engaging in international affairs, now the memo had to be forwarded to the CIA so they could keep a minute-to-minute track on Malcolm's affairs. So now Malcolm is no longer considered a domesticated Black nationalist, Pan-Africanist, anti-Americanist. He's now have the potential, right, to actually change the dynamics of the civil rights movement in America, moving it to the level of what? Human rights. And not only that, one of the things that the CIA recognized in Malcolm is that his delivery or his narrative abroad was not as harsh, and racist as it was in America. So that they actually had to redefine Malcolm as he made that transition, because they thought they was going to actually be encountering the Malcolm X in America, the fiery, racist, anti-white, anti-American. But when they began to see Malcolm bridging the gap between international, with the international community, recognizing the International Brotherhood of Islam, they was afraid that he could now come back and integrate in the civil rights movement. And he would not only would he have the 100,000 NOI members following him, but now he had the potential to influence millions of the civil rights activists. So his power and his influence would have increased.
Sheikh, but NOI, I mean, was that a possibility? I mean, could NOI really be affected by it? Because, I mean, there's things in the book that says that, like, they didn't really like that he was becoming so anti-Elijah, for instance. And and also it seems like Elijah Muhammad himself, he was thinking that Malcolm, he's going to get himself in trouble for sure, because he knew what his limitations are within the country, what he's being told, how he's being managed. But the moment, so in some ways, him being part of NIO, he was, NOI, he was put under an umbrella of a limitation. They knew how far he can go. And so the point that when he splits from Nation of Islam, he actually becomes a problem. And that's kind of ironic in a sense that you would think that a movement like Nation of Islam would have been would actually be the problem, because it was so organized already.
Yes. Now, that's a good point that you made. Let's look at it this way. Malcolm was the Nation of Islam. He was that iconic image. And of course, there was some jealousy within the higher elites of that community, because Malcolm had more exposure than Elijah Muhammad. It was not that Elijah thought that Malcolm would get himself in trouble. It was that Malcolm would get the Nation of Islam in trouble, because now he was breaking protocol of an agreed, structured agenda that he was actually to advocate, such as maintain the idea of segregation, separation of races, and so forth and so on. So as long as Malcolm was doing that, he was contained. So what happened was Elijah Muhammad he had alliances with other people who actually had made agreements that they would actually allow them to continue to do what they would do without any harassment and so forth and so on. But Malcolm himself, beginning to move outside of that space, began to cause problems for the Nation of Islam in their relationship to other people. Now, did Malcolm have the potential to destroy the Nation of Islam foundation? Of course he did, because what happened was Malcolm was just one of the first outside of the royal family, what we call the elite family, the blood relatives of Elijah Muhammad. They knew the level of corruption that was going on inside of the organization, and they were benefiting from that. So they weren't concerned about whether Malcolm was a threat to the society or any other entity, as long as it didn't affect, their position. But when Malcolm began to expose the hypocrisy of the Nation of Islam, and number one, when he come from Mecca, he began to explain to many of the members that they weren't practicing Islam according to what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessing be upon him, had brought. So a lot of people began to defect. As you know, Malcolm's core group of re-establishing the Muslim Mosque Incorporated was actually defectos from the Nation of Islam. It was very few that he recruited that had no affiliation with the Nation of Islam. So it was obvious that the wave of defecting members of the Nation of Islam was going towards Malcolm, because they only knew Malcolm on a personal basis, because Elijah Muhammad was in Chicago, Malcolm was in New York, he was in Philadelphia, he was in Boston. He was actually in the very core of the growth of the Nation of Islam. So they had more affinity to Malcolm in that sense. What happened is the hate and the rhetoric that came from Chicago was based on those captains that had invested interest in the not only the revenue, but actually the control of the Black movement in America at that time. And they was afraid they may lose their grip.
Sheikh, I mean, the way you're describing, I mean, look, the words lieutenants and people. So, I mean, NOI's role was exactly what in the United States. I mean, this is an organization. I mean, you cannot consider this a militant organization. So, what is the the Nation of Islam? Because let me just so one more thing here. So, and then you can, when I look at, New York, when I look at New Jersey, and when I look at Chicago, till today, the personalities of, Muslims that belong to a Nation of Islam or any other, let's say Black movements are very different, Sheikh. And it really is. I mean, when I work in the inner cities here, I almost see there's a vacuum between the level of understanding that exists in the African Americans in New York and New Jersey, unless I'm wrong, but or do you you visit Chicago and stuff like? Do you see the same type of, let's say, awareness, and the kind of maybe understanding what has happened to African Americans? Does that exist across the United States, or is it certain cities, Sheikh, that are much more aware and hence have certain personalities have come out of these cities?
I would say the East Coast is more aware, and they are more civically engaging than the Chicago and the Midwest. A lot happened on the East Coast here, because we have Washington, D.C., we have the capital, we have New York City, the financial capital of the world. I think that we have more, there's more to protect, okay, on the East Coast. We have the consulates, we have the embassies and so forth. So, and the accessibility for the exchange of information is greater. Okay. I mean, diplomats and international personalities, they land first at JFK, you see, not the O'Hara Airport. They interact, on an international level here. And what has happened is our masjids and our Islamic communities have served as hosts for a lot of very, very high profile people. And there's been a high level of exchange of information where possibly in the Midwest, they have not been privy to that type of engagement. So that's why you would find Malcolm more prolific in this area than he would have been in Chicago. Chicago is like a landlocked city. It doesn't have a lot of, and of course, Chicago has a different culture. It is more, it's kind of like I'm not saying this in a negative way, but they're kind of like out of the loop, because it's almost like the war's over, but yet you still have on the uniform. Okay. Meaning that certain things that Malcolm was actually advocating in the 60s is no longer appropriate at this particular time. We've moved beyond that point. But when you structure an organization based on control, then you create what we call a chain of command, and you orientate those members to follow the chain of command. And I think that on the East Coast, we've understood Islam in a different way. Even the Nation of Islam members out here operate different and more fluent and more, there's a lot of more interaction, you know what I'm saying? And that's an advantage, because what happened is many of them now are being exposed, not just to the theology of the Sunni Islam, but the actually practicality, personalities, masjids, and now they can compare. At one time, the Nation of Islam had a monopoly, okay, on what was Islam and what was not Islam, to the point that it was actually intimidating to our Muslim brothers who had come from foreign countries who knew that they weren't actually practicing Islam, but it was so intimidating that they didn't want to engage because they fear reprisals. Because we do have a law in this country that if you actually harm a person through defamation of character, or you actually defame their religious beliefs, which we have the freedom of religion, there can be some monetary consequences in that. And there can also be some social consequences, and it would not look good as far as international relations. So a lot of the immigrants that come to America, especially at a level of Islamic scholarship and have diplomatic immunity, they stay away from engaging, okay, based on these particular restrictions. So that's why we don't see a fatwa on the Nation of Islam. We can easily find a fatwa on the Ahmadiyyas. We can easily find a fatwa on the Moorish. We can easily find a fatwa on the Shia or different groups. But when it comes to the Nation of Islam, we are silent and we tolerate their presence. Okay, and
that is interesting. Yeah,
that's because that we don't want to violate any constitutional rights.
But that's interesting. That is actually, yes. So I mean, there's no fatwa on them that they are, let's say, they're not in the fold of Islam.
Yes.
And that the concern was that it might alienate them from.
Yes, it can fall under the category of religious persecution, defamation of character. I mean, and if there's a loss or harm within that, then there can be a lawsuit. You know, it's the same way that Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz was trying to take the United States to the United Nations to condemn them for human rights violation, because there was a right that was taken away or denied to a people. You know, and when we're talking about civil rights, we talk about the Constitution, freedom of speech. It's the same way. If I deny you the freedom of speech, or if I say that your religion is not correct and it caused harm or it caused loss inside of the fold of that group, then of course there's recourse in that legally. So I mean, they are briefed on that. And of course, that's why we say la ikraha fi din, there's no compulsion in religion. We don't compel anyone. So we take the route of just explaining what the Prophet ﷺ brought, what is the sunnah of our beloved messenger, and we let everyone fend for themselves until they find the right way. And of course, growing up as a Muslim in America, we didn't take that position. We were very adamant, we were very outspoken, and we were very transparent as to who was a Muslim and was not a Muslim. Okay.
But is that because you can? I mean, you are from here. I mean, you're
yes. I mean, yes. It would look very odd for someone to come from abroad and condemn a group in America who is perceived to be uplifting the downtrodden and the rejected, who's actually in the eye of the storm for social justice. You would look like an informant. You would look like someone who's actually trying to offset a positive action. You see? And of course, you would not get a good feedback from the masses of the people who may not be Muslim. As you have to understand in America is that we have something called the herd mentality, that people, they may not be a Muslim or they may not be affiliated with a particular political party or ideology, but the suffering and the deprivation and the degradation and the segregation and racism, right, reaches all of these people. So you're going to find a certain level of affinity and support regardless of faith.
SubhanAllah. Sheikh, okay, so on that issue itself, I saw certain comments under the first episode that we did that the reason why NOI preached segregation and separation was it was needed at the time. They had to be different. They had to create a certain type of environment to empower the blacks. I mean, is that your understanding of because you are saying is that should not have happened from day one?
what I'm saying is that should not have happened under the umbrella of Islam. If they would have structured an organization like Marcus Garvey, the Negro Improvement Association, different organizations that did not claim authoritative position with Islam, then we would not have a problem. We would have looked at the Nation of Islam like the Black Panther Party. We would looked at them as the RAM, the Revolutionary Action Committee. We would looked at them as the Southern Negro, what we call it.
So you're saying
nonviolent, the Southern nonviolent. Yes.
It would be just an organization rather than Islam.
Yes. But what happened is when you make a claim to saying this is Islam and you are actually indoctrinating the people, then that's misleading. So it becomes mandatory for those who actually are representing and trying to preserve the pristine teachings of Islam. We have to come forward and set the record straight. You have to set the narrative straight. And what happened is even Malcolm within his life, okay, he set a precedent because he actually moved out of that theology into the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So we're not doing anything different than Malcolm did. He did it on a microcosm. We're doing it on a macrocosm. But that was our position even when Malcolm was advocating the theology of the Nation of Islam. So if they had not made those claims, then we would have looked at it just like the civil rights movement or any other Black nationalist social justice movement and possibly join that group as we join hands with other groups that had the same invested interest. But it's just the fact that they claim Islam and the messengership of Elijah Muhammad, and they actually advocated that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was actually incarnated in a human being and things like that. All of these things in the international, even within the very distant fundamentals of Islam, will have to be rejected. And that was our position against the Nation of Islam.
Sheikh, as far as the timing, let's say, the time of Malcolm X, Soviet Union was around. How much worried how worried, let's say, US was and others that Soviet Union could have used the blacks in this country for their own purposes?
There was,
and because you already had, Black Panthers who were in many ways communist, and they that's what they, at least the backgrounds. Black Panthers were supposed to be a communist party, but NOI was. Okay, it called itself Muslim and against communism. And NOI exists till today.
Yeah, the NOI was apolitical. They were not for or against anything. They had their own island, so they posed no threat. Okay, it was a stalemate as far as their political expansion. Of course, they could have gotten numbers, increased their numbers. They could have increased their wealth. Well, as far as actually having some real impact in the direction that the United States was going politically at that time on an international level, they had no influence in that. And that's why when Malcolm Al-Hajmi Shabazz had that moment with Fidel Castro, it was a great concern that because they didn't know which direction the Nation of Islam was going to go. Elijah Muhammad, as we all know, was a human being. And human beings have a timeline, a lifeline in this world. So, and we're talking about in the 60s, so he was actually an Asian person. So, and Malcolm was second in charge. So if they lose Elijah Muhammad, that means the whole structure, okay, had to be redesigned. And Malcolm was not in line with the structure that Elijah Muhammad had set up with the country. So it was a great threat that possibly Malcolm could have aligned himself with one of the socialist countries. And of course, we saw the Panthers on a small scale identify with socialism, with communism, as an alternative. And they thought that was the solution for oppression. And if you notice those countries, the African states that had embraced socialism and communism was given refuge to those Panthers who actually had to leave the country for whatever reasons. They was able to go in those socialist countries, not because they was supporting the Black Revolution in America, the Black human rights or civil rights movement, only because they had a political agenda that was actually based on the same principles of communism. Now, and as you know, that it was a lottery, and it was like a gold rush. that America was trying to get the concessions in Africa. Russia was trying to get the concessions in Africa because both countries was rebuilding themselves after World War II. So America, and of course we see that at the end results that America and Russia split the political states of Africa. But we could have been an aggravation and possibly a revolt, and resources could have been allotted to some of the people that were actually on the side of socialism, being able to go outside the country to redesign their strategies in dealing with the United States. And not only that, the idea of socialism was not only confined within the Black communities, because the idea of socialism was introduced to the Panthers and other Black movements by white Americans who was not satisfied with the capitalistic structure that they was under. So we found that there was an alliance between white socialists, and Black socialists. So that actually superseded the racial limitations that divided us at that particular time.
So you're saying there could have been that was one thing that would have crossed racial lines, and it would have been much more. I mean, they're worried about the impact of these two coming together, whether not on the basis of color, but actually in ideology.
Yes, that would have been impactful. And as we saw when Malcolm made the transition and became a Sunni Muslim, so the idea of religion, what we had what we call a Black style Nation of Islam, Black nationalist umbrella, or what we call disguised as religion, that was contained. But when Malcolm actually began to involve himself with the Muslims on an international level, now racism itself became insignificant. Okay, now the faith of Islam, posed a threat, because now Malcolm had 1 billion people listening to him. Okay, not 100 million, but now he had 1 billion people. So now the hope of relief of social injustice was greater. Okay, and of course that posed a great threat within the FBI and also local law enforcement agencies.
Sheikh, before we go to the chapter of actual assassination, but this, subhanAllah, I just lost my. I wanted to. Khalas, I mean, there was something I wanted to ask. Really. Let me put it here. Sheikh, the Louis Farrakhan. I mean, he's alive and well today still. And then you have, I guess, politically, can African Americans use NOI as forget from the religious perspective, but as political base to build some foundations in the country? I guess I'm saying from the perspective of gaining power and having some type of a say in what happens in the direction that the United States goes in, domestic policies for inner cities, because we don't even see that being played by the NOI. I mean, it plays no role other than what role does it play now?
Well, I think that it's a fading organization. And the problem that we have as Americans is that, we have been orientated in a democracy. So when we're not accustomed to dictators, people who have sole authority and the direction that we should go or turn. This is not in our culture. And when you take a personality like Minister Louis Farrakhan, he has the last word. He has the first word and he has the last word. And of course, he's only keeping the Black and white nexus alive. As I mentioned, that we've moved far beyond that. There's no benefit in just having an ethnic identity inside of a democracy, with so much diversity. It's time for engagement. Okay. And if you look at the lifespan of the Nation of Islam, you're talking about 1934, we're talking about 80 years plus of an organization, and there have not been any significant economic empowerment that has grown from that organization. And it's almost like a conveyor belt, people coming in and people going out. Of course, they identify with the hype because it's a false hope that through this actual channel that you're going to gain your freedom, you're going to gain economic empowerment, you're going to regain your identity, and you're going to have a power base and something to say. But for the most part, the Nation of Islam is also apolitical. You may have Minister Louis Farrakhan commenting on a political personality, but he's politically correct. He's actually taking a party side. Either he's speaking from a Democratic perspective, or he's speaking from a Republican perspective. He does not have a unique identity that's attracting people to say, what do you have to offer to the people that's going to move us to the next level? And that's one of the problems that the Americans have identified. We've moved through the civil rights. We've moved through the human rights issues. And it's about, engagement now. People finding, like minds coming together. As you can look in New York, we just had a Muslim mayor elected. And that speaks for itself, that people are not really looking at religion or ethnicity as a criteria anymore. They're looking at commonality, like minds. What agenda are you offering? What program or portfolio are you putting on the table that we all can benefit from? Because they have realized over the many years that this ethnic or political agendas that has been presented, they have all failed to produce. So now that's why we have a person who actually have no real
experience,
political identity, saying, well, I'm for this, I'm from that. But what are we for as a whole? So the Nation of Islam, and of course, as Muslims, we don't look at secularism and religion as being something different. Every aspect, Islam is holistic. So everything in our religion, our faith, is governed by something. And the way we earn our money, the way we spend our money, how we engage with Muslims, how we engage with non-Muslims, how we live inside of a Muslim society, and how we live outside of a Muslim society and a non-Muslim society. What are the rules of engagement? All of that has been laid clear for us, and we follow scholarship. We follow clear ijma, what we call the consensus of guidance. So Farrakhan would have to actually join the Muslims in order to get their confidence that we can move forward by committee, not by one person having the first and last word.
Sheikh, so you mentioned Mamdani, in I guess, well, at least what's happened in New York.
Yes.
Is this, his election, do you look at it as people speaking out in a sense that, you're in the most capitalist city in the world, but you cannot afford rent, you cannot afford day care, you can't afford transportation to go to work so that you can pay for rent and you can pay for daycare. He's speaking to the most, basic needs of human beings. Electing him or selecting him, however you want to put it, is this an outcry? Because people screaming with pain in some ways that anything will do at this point, or because at the end of the day, again, this is just a question out there, but
yes.
Because when Trump was elected, Trump was known as an outsider. He came also somebody that doesn't have an experience in government. He wasn't your average Washingtonian. He wasn't speaking like the politicians that that speak. Same thing. Mamdani came. He was not talking like Cuomo or whoever, and has no experience. But he's taking one of the largest cities in the world. So when you're looking at this, as really what's happening. In general, in the United States.
Yes. First and foremost, I think that we must understand, that Mamdani, he is a Muslim. That's number one. He is a Muslim, but he's not. But as the Muslims in America, we don't look at him as the Amir of the Muslims.
Yeah.
So because it can be misinformation. a lot of Muslims are under the impression because he is a Muslim, that means now this is an advantage and a victory for the Muslims. No, this is a victory for the people. Okay, for those people who don't have the resources. And I think that
somebody's speaking out, is that what it is? Someone at least is out there speaking out.
And I think that what has happened is that sometimes, you want the most rejected. Sometimes the most rejected has more attraction than those who you feel that, more qualified and so forth. So I think that what has happened inside of America, that people has become frustrated. And as you mentioned, Donald Trump is not politically savvy. He don't have the language of the politicians. But he, like I said, the politicians work for corporate America. And Donald Trump is a part of that corporate structure. So he's actually coming back into the space to make sure that corporate America is protected, because the politicians have made a mess of it. So it's more so that he's actually putting the money changers back in their proper place. Okay. And of course, the little people, as we have come to understand, has really, if any, influence on the direction of that the country is going. So whatever we say about Donald Trump, whatever we say about his policies, it seems as though it's business as usual the next day. Donald Trump does what Donald Trump's going to do. Now, that's a contrast to Mamdani. So the people there no longer want to hear the politicians. Okay. They want to hear the grassroots speak. And he's actually the voice of the people. Okay. So the need and what he has promised to deliver, right, took precedence over his religion. And I say one thing that is an advantage is that Islam, the Islamophobia will lessen. And avenues and gateways and doors can be opened for progress for the Muslims, because we must understand that New York is the city of 9/11. It is the city.
I was going to ask you regarding that, but I didn't want to mention in that.
There have been a lot of tension, okay, in Islamophobia against Muslim, and that is in the political arena. But when you come down to earth and you visit the masjids and you visit the Muslim families, you see what the Muslims are doing in the society, and you find less Muslims committing crimes in larger cities than you find non-Muslim. So it's a misnomer and it's a misinformation that's been propagated by media and press. So people are now beginning to say, well, we're no longer going to listen to the politics. And I think that Donald Trump, at least he made people open their minds. Say, look, fake news, you can't believe everything you hear. Get off the internet, interact with the human being. And I think this is what happened in New York. This is a dynamic. But at the same time, we should not look for anything extra. We should not look for the mayor of New York to break laws for a particular group. Okay, all we expect from him is to deliver what is the rights of the people, to make sure that the New Yorkers have housing, make sure that the New Yorkers have food and clothing and education, that he can actually create a model that can resonate in other states. And we can see and of course, I think that being a Muslim has a balance and a sense of justice and fairness. Okay. And this is something that the society is going to be actually gauging him on. This is like a barometer for all the other 49 states. So let us look at the positive outcome of that type of personality, who's actually the voice of the grassroots, who has been deprived of all the social amenities that could have made their life comfortable because of the political quagmire that has blocked the flow of resources to those people.
I like the way you put it. There has to be a discussion we have to have with you on this whole situation of the election and what's happening in the minds of people. Sheikh, going back to the discussion here on Malcolm X, obviously discussing Malcolm X opens up a lot of, there's many things that are happening the day of the killing of Malcolm X, the assassination of Malcolm X, when I'm reading that chapter, it almost tells me that Malcolm knew that it's coming very close. And the powers that be also kind of figured out that, look, we have to silence him, but it cannot be a race war. This cannot turn into a race war. And they were concerned that if the authorities do it, it will turn that, or even if just a white person does it, it will become a race war. And they had identified, according to what you're saying in the book, they had identified organizations that get the job done.
Yes.
And you're saying, I mean, I don't know if it's the right way to ask. I mean, NOI offered itself?
Okay. I want to go back and give you a thought on this. You know, Dr. King was assassinated by a white person who always denied he was actually an assassin, because they wanted a race war. They wanted, to create a confusion because he was the civil rights bill. They wanted to offset. There was a lot of angry people. So those supremacist groups wanted to start a race war at that point, riots and so forth. Now, with Malcolm,
the case of
Malcolm was very different because they didn't want to create a messiah, and martyr. Okay, because what has happened is that Malcolm, all eyes was on Malcolm, and as I mentioned earlier, that regardless of Malcolm's faith, he had 22 million Negroes, so-called Negroes at that time, that social classification, that's almost like the N-word now if you use it out of context.
I mean, it's hard to quote him sometimes because the word is there. So I have to be careful.
Just for consistency in the narrative, but within context, it has its place. But so they didn't want to create that kind of conflict within racial, because it would have actually solidified or validated what Malcolm was saying. There was a race of evil people. So they didn't want that on the record. However, Malcolm himself was viewed as a threat, for national security. Okay. Now, when we look at the law enforcement agencies, it's something that people overlook a lot. The FBI agent, Arthur Fulton, was assigned to Malcolm. Not weekly or monthly, but every single day. He had to surveil Malcolm every single day. Now, what happened is you have informants and you have agents. See, an informant is not a law enforcement agent. An informant is just a regular person you draft in, okay, with a verbal agreement to collect information for monetary incentives. So what happened is Arthur Fulton, who was actually the head of the FBI, he was assigned to Malcolm at the age of about 27. So he himself recruited, informants. And from his own words, he said he had about 9 informants inside of the Audubon Ballroom the day that Malcolm was killed. Okay, and not only that.
Right, I was going to mention, so 9, they were present on the day.
Right, on the inside. So in Bossy, the Bureau of Social, Bureaus of Secret Services, they had about 6 or 7 informants. Now, when I say an informant, that's a person that they recruit. So now you have people around Malcolm, because he had no criteria of joining his organization, coming inside of, to hear his lecture. So how could you differentiate as to who was actually a loyalist to Malcolm and an informant? It was no checks and balances to say who was informant. Okay, now, and we find out in the end the possibility of why these people were informants. Okay, so now you have agents. The only agent that we have identified that's on record is Gene Roberts. Okay, he was recruited by the Bureau of Special Services, Bossy. And he was actually, as Tony Boza, who was actually the lieutenant in charge of that particular aspect of Malcolm's life, in his own word, he said that the person that was closest to Malcolm the day he was assassinated, right, actually worked for us. Okay, so now this is one of the elite security guards, okay, who Malcolm confided and freely shared information about his itinerary, his travels, the people he would meet with. And of course, there was more informants that Malcolm had, confidence that they would actually keep information, contained within that core group. But they were informants and they were agents. So Malcolm had no escape. So even though he's telling this person, A is trying to assassinate me or B is trying to assassinate me, he was talking to A about B. Or he may be talking to B about A, because that's how close it was. So Malcolm had come to the conclusion that there was no escape. That, I'm all in now. So all I have to do now is unload, is to actually expose the Nation of Islam and expose the boss here, expose the FBI. Malcolm himself was supposed to give the list of those who was actually trying to assassinate him on the day of his assassination. He had that list on him. Okay, so Malcolm knew that the war
he was keeping it on him. I mean, there was a list.
Yes, he had the list. He had the list that he was going to expose that day. He was going to actually let the people know that these are the people who are actually trying to assassinate me. As we know, Leon Amir himself was visited by some members of the Nation of Islam, NOI, and they asked him for asylum so they could actually assassinate Malcolm. And he actually went and told Malcolm. So, and he was actually a former NOI member. So there was an integration of loyalists and informants that Malcolm couldn't. It got to a point that he could not differentiate between the pros and the cons. So he was actually left for the slaughter. And that went very well with those other law enforcement agencies, because because the NOI had invested interest for removing Malcolm, because we know that they felt that he was defaming Elijah Muhammad, that he was slated to go to court about the paternity suit and so forth. And one thing that is interesting in Talmadge Hayer's affidavit, he said that he was approached by two brothers, okay, and they actually interrogated him about what did they think about Malcolm and his defaming, Elijah and so forth. So he said that a person like that should be removed, and he actually joined the team. And the first affidavit, he said he didn't know them, but then in the second affidavit, he said he knew them well. So he actually was beginning to unfold and share information. And it took him from 65 to 77 to actually break his silence.
That he was informant. No, he was the actual agent. He was actually agent on the case. Oh, no. He was working with the NOI.
Hayes was the one that was approached, right? And he did not expose any of this information. So he stayed almost from 65 to 1977. Okay, you're talking about more than 10 years. With his silence, he didn't expose anyone. So when he came out with the affidavit, he began to say, these were the people who were with me. This is what we did. This is how we orchestrated it, and so forth and so on. There was money on the table. He denied meeting with certain personalities in the Nation of Islam. In the second affidavit, he actually said he did meet with them. We have FBI records that substantiate that. And so what I'm saying this is say that when an informant, and most of the time we look at someone who's an informant, we think they have a distinct identity amongst the members. No, they are the same, that you can't distinguish. So now he actually revealed the name. It's important to recognize that the people he named was never arrested and brought to trial. Now, J. Edgar Hoover said no informants should testify in that case. So when you look at all of these people who actually were eyewitnesses that were in the space of the Audubon Ballroom the day of his assassination, okay, who have affidavit but never went to the stand and testify, who actually were eyewitnesses, then you have to wonder, were these people a part of the infiltration of Malcolm's organization? Even though after Malcolm's assassination, for many years, they was able to restructure their lives without any police investigation or harassment. So that's something to look at, the cover up, because if these informants would have taken the stand, then they would have pointed to their superiors, their handlers, and those handlers were law enforcement agencies. So we'd have known long before the 50 years of the exoneration of two people that was wrongly convicted, we'd have known 50 years ago who they actually were. Okay. Now, one of the elite security guards for Malcolm was Reuben Francis. He was the only one, ironically, that was armed on that day inside of the ballroom who actually exchanged fire with Talmadge Hayer, and he actually shot him in the leg with a 45.
Yeah.
Now, I look at that as the Jack Ruby syndrome. Okay, Jack Ruby was to silence Lee Harvey Oswald so that the case would be blotched about the investigation of Kennedy. Now, if Talmadge Hayer would have been killed, or that would have been a fatal shot, then the investigation of Malcolm would have stopped right there with one disoriented person, who had a disdain for Malcolm, okay, killed him, and that the case would have closed. And he, in the beginning, said he wasn't a Muslim, and he never said that the Muslims were involved. But in his affidavits, he pointed that the Muslims come from, the temple in New Jersey. So it became transparent.
You mean NOI here, of course.
Yes, NOI. The NOI came from that particular area. Now, another interesting part is that one of the roster guards, there was two of them, Charles Blackwell, and the other one, I can't think of his name right now off the top of my head. There was two roster guards who was new. One of them was from Temple Number 7, a defecto from the NOI, and the other one from the masjid and the mosque in Newark. And they were roster guards. And Charles Blackwell said he recognized members from 25 sitting in the front rows. Okay. And of course, so what I'm saying is that it was so transparent that they could have closed the case if they would have allowed those people who were eyewitnesses to come forward. But as I said, those informants would have pointed to their handlers, which was actually law enforcement agencies, who actually gave them an escape plan. Why would you not investigate? And those people who were loyalists to Malcolm, you have to ask the question, why did they not take a concerted effort to go out and seek and find those people who they knew was involved in that assassination? They remained silent.
Sheikh, well, I mean, this, I'm sure, what if, can there be a rebuttal for this by NOI? I mean, let's say somebody watches this video, it goes to them. After all, this is Chicago. Let's say somebody's watching this thing and it says, I mean, this, can someone say these are allegations?
Now, yes, they can say that, but the burden of proof it lies on the one who's actually complaining. So what I'm saying is these are affidavits, sworn affidavits.
So these are actual papers that exist.
Yes, we have FBI files, surveillance. We have video clippings. We have transcribed confessions from tapes. I mean, everything that's in the book can be verified. Okay, it can be verified. And many people are unaware of that history. Many people are unaware that Minister Louis Farrakhan was actually at Temple Number 25 on the day of Malcolm's assassination. Okay, I mean...
and why is that significant, Sheikh? Because he was speaking at the ballroom. But why is that significant? I'm not sure what you're saying.
What happened is that the FBI records and also Thomas Hess in his affidavit said that the assassins came from 25. Okay, so now...
wow.
So they are a close-knit, because what happened is Benjamin Kareem, who was actually one of the elite security guards for Malcolm X, said that they knew all the people from Temple Number 7, and that if anyone came from Mosque Number 7, they was ordered to search them because they knew that was the immediate threat and opposition. So they knew these people, and that is why he said that Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson was not in the Audubon Ballroom at that time, because he would have recognized them. For some unexplained reason, he was very adamant about freeing them. Now, and I have to ask the question, if he himself could not identify, the assassins, because he said he wasn't actually at the podium during that event, and also he did not testify in the trial, how can he be sure that they weren't there in some part and form? I mean, that's just a question that comes to my mind. How can you swear that they weren't there when you did not witness the assassination? But at the same time, that the members from Temple 25 were unknown to the New York security. So it was very easy for them to come in. And of course, if you look at the platform and the seating arrangement, you can see that it was well orchestrated. Okay.
Sheikh Malcolm didn't recognize these things. He didn't see that and say, this is, I'm sure he knew what was happening. He saw the people, he probably maybe even recognized some of them. And I mean, because the total number was 400 people in the room.
Yes.
Something like that, right? About 400 people were in that room. Informants, I mean, even this, you were saying that I guess when NYPD came in, the police, when they came in, they almost kind of knew that this was supposed to be done like this.
Yes. Okay. Let me address that while I have my thought. See, first and foremost, Malcolm relied on his security. So, and of course, when you look at the stage setting and Malcolm coming to the podium, it was less than a minute before he was assassinated. Upon the greeting, and then the disturbance in the back, and then the assassin rose from their seats and they went forward to the podium. The Rasta guards violated protocol because they went to the disturbance. And this is something they were trained not to do. And why would these Rasta guards leave their post and leave Malcolm bare? So, and there was no one from his elite team that was actually in the front that witnessed, that actually said they eyewitnessed the assassination. Even Gene Roberts, the agent himself, said that he encountered Talmadge Hague trying to escape, and he actually shot him on his jacket, and he knocked him down with a chair, so forth and so on. And of course, Talmadge Hague, in my opinion, was the fall guy, because by him not being able to escape, all the weight came on him. And he took that weight, with a sense of pride for many years. But once he began to figure out he was a patsy, he began to start, exposing them. Now, if you look at the speech that Malcolm did a week before that, there was motion film, 6mm film for the whole lecture. This particular lecture, we have only one roll of film. The FBI confiscated 4 rolls of motion footage. Okay? And they concealed that. And within that footage was actually the seating arrangements and the actual Audubon ballroom and so forth and so on. And they only allow one roll to be seen today. Okay, so you actually, when you look at the footage of Haj Malik Shabazz and the aftermath of assassination, that's only one roll of motion film. There is another 3 rolls that we don't have access to today. Okay, that is the Audubon ballroom audience before and after the assassination. So
you don't even see the audience. You see maybe 2 or 3 rows.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Okay, now what happened is the film that you're actually watching and that they're actually insert is not the film of the day of the 21st. That's the week before. But what they do is they actually, they edited that in as though that is the actual audience at that particular moment. But we don't have the film of the audience that particular day. So, but like I said, that film has never come back to us. And I'm saying that to say that when you look at Reuben Francis, he was the actual one who actually exchanged fire with Talmadge Hague. He himself, right, was arrested for carrying a firearm and actually, shooting Talmadge Hague. And of course, he disappeared, never to be found, never to resurface again, and never testified in the trial. Okay.
I guess was he in jail, Sheikh?
He actually got out on bond. He was actually arrested just for that, the shooting.
Because supposedly then later on there was found that he was being paid $3,000, something like this. Is that same?
No, you're talking about this is Talmadge Hague. I'm talking about Reuben Francis. Reuben Francis is the one who shot him. And the police arrested him, and he actually was released on bail, and he disappeared.
Oh, wow.
No one has seen him. He'd never resurfaced since that particular event. He did not testify. Okay. So we have to wonder why. Okay. Gene Roberts, who actually was the agent of Bossy, he never testified. Richard Jones, who is the guy you see on the stage with Malcolm in his last moments, he's the one that you see apprehending Talmadge Hague on the outside of the Audubon Ballroom. He's the one who's pulling the gurney to the hospital across the street. He is the one that he allegedly said that the police asked him when they captured Talmadge, is he one of us? He is the one who actually conveyed that particular narrative to the attorney. He never testified. He said he feared for his life, so he went out of the range so that he would be protected. Benjamin Kareem, who was the one who opened up for Malcolm, he did an affidavit, but he never went on the stands. So we have so many people that should have come forward, okay, that did not testify. James 67X, who was actually second in charge. As the roster guard said, that they could not engage with police unless they had a briefing by James 67X. So it was orchestrated to protect those people who may have had some involvement, who possibly allowed it to happen without trying to involve themselves. And of course, as you know, being just in the company of Malcolm with that level of intensity and threats, even your life could have been in danger just by accompanying him. Okay. Right. Yeah. So they were afraid to be in the same space in close proximity under those circumstances, because they knew, based on the informants, their association, and the nature of the NOI, that their lives too could be taken if they were really supporters of Malcolm at that level. And of course, when Malcolm was assassinated, many of his people, many of his elite and organization members, they defected from the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, the Organization of Afro-American Union, and they went back and they rejoined the Nation of Islam.
Yeah, this is another, which is very not surprising knowing now what we know now, but it's so Sheikh, in the aftermath of the assassination, what happens now? What's NOI thinking? I mean, there'll be reprisals. Were there any reprisals? Everyone was just kind of like, okay, no one knows what's going on. How did the public look at this thing, Sheikh, as the assassination of Malcolm X? I mean, and in those days, in that time, in the events as this is happening, because you have, I mean, it's assassinations going on. You have Martin Luther King is assassinated, and you have Malcolm X assassinated, and I think even Kennedy was assassinated. What's the environment like, Sheikh, at the time, political environment?
Well, the people were fed press. The media took charge of informing the people about the aftermath. If you wanted to know anything about what happened to Malcolm, you had to read the New York Times, the New York Post, Daily.
So lack of information.
Right. So the information was controlled. The press began to feed the people. As you know, Malcolm had a negative image in his departure. They did not capture his last years in his last months as a Muslim, how he recanted certain aspects of his former beliefs. They just took him down as a hate monger. And of course, a lot of people pushed back from Malcolm because they was like, well, they just removed another troublemaker. What we must understand too is that Malcolm was the type of person, even though you agree with what he was saying, he was a person that was very risky to be among. He was a person that was very risky to identify with. Okay, to become a Muslim NOI member at that particular time, it could have been some consequences in your employment, your association, things of this nature. So a lot of people were actually distant affiliates. They wanted results. They wanted the relief of social injustice. They wanted that, but to identify with that paradigm was very risky. Dr. King had a more suitable approach to acquiring social justice. So a lot of people really weren't embracing the Malcolm X agenda, because based on the limitation and what they knew about Malcolm, and of course, the public is uninformed about many matters. Many people didn't even know that there was a difference between the Nation of Islam and the Sunni Muslim. They were under the impression that Malcolm was a Muslim in the 50s. They didn't see any significance in that transition. His bad history followed him into his last breath. So they thought that they assassinated Malcolm X as opposed to El-Hajj Malik Shabazz. And that's why we are, as Muslims, we are obligated to pick up that banner and correct the narrative. It's just something that needs to be understood because it's still some kind of conspiracy. It's still some type of unfinished business. The Nation of Islam, the NOI, seems to be exonerated from that type of involvement, because these records have been sealed for many years. And people read no further than the first page. Okay, they read the headlines and they take that to be factual. And of course, the law enforcement have spent tons of resources to seal this information, to protect those informants, to make sure that they don't get on record for being involved at that level. And of course, as time has taken its course, many of those people have died, have passed away, and a lot of the retired FBI agents, the police officers, they feel very confident and comfortable that they can say what actually happened. They show no remorse. And if you understand the structure of America, they feel that they did the United States a justice by removing a dissident. So they have no remorse. And of course, now with the third generation, Malcolm has come up as one of our most prolific, revered civil rights activists, when at that moment, he was one of the most hated and rejected, Black advocates in America by the structure, the power structure that we're in today. So we got to be very careful how we approach the Malcolm X. And again, if there's a refutation of what I'm saying, then we can actually go to the FBI files. And that's why I put a lot of documents. If you look at the book, I have a lot of new clips. I have a lot of FBI records, because people are.
it's overwhelming, to be honest. I was trying to go over that, and I said, no, that the chefs do this.
That the narrative is there, and that this information has been far removed from the public, so that we've been guessing our way through the Malcolm assassination, and we don't know how to embrace him. And of course, and a lot of time you see collages, when in the background when people are talking about Malcolm, and they have Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm in the same space on the same collage, when actually it should be separate. And you have to actually read Malcolm's recantations, his speeches, his reputations. He made the record clear that he was no longer affiliated with the Nation of Islam, that he was no longer in the straitjackets of Elijah Muhammad, that he was a Sunni Muslim, and he believed in La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, and he was willing to work with all the Muslims and all the social justice activists and so forth and so on. And that is the biggest threat that had come into the space of America in that short period of time. 11 months, he became a major threat, to the point that they restructured, a surveillance on how will Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik Shabazz develop, and what choices he will make along the road. And also,
Go ahead.
But let me say this before you get to the next question. And of course, as I mentioned, the paternity suit, and upon his assassination, the ladies or the secretaries that was actually pressing charges, they dropped the charges for fear of their own lives. So there was never a case based on that.
Okay, two final questions here. One, the intellect of Malcolm X. Let's say Mark Shahbaz, rahmatullah alayh. Sheikh Hamid, what is Malcolm reading? That is he reading? Is it his reading that makes him who he is, or is his environment that made him who he is?
It's a little of both, but I think that he was in the environment, he understood the environment, but he needed to understand how to articulate it in a manner in which he could express it and explain it to the people, and making it plain that they could understand what was actually going on. A lot of people was so docile that they just accepted oppression. In fact, they were so comfortable with just a meal at the end of the day and a roof over their heads. They didn't really expect more than what they could acquire through their own hands and so forth. But Malcolm he knew this because he, like I said, he had compared the United States with other countries. He had compared the North with the South. He had compared the blacks with the white. He was very inquisitive. So the environment.
Look, Sheikh, there's a statement by Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah, he said, if you don't like to read, then just travel. That would be enough of a teacher. I mean, many people, that was one of his, thousands of statements from Imam Shafi'i, rahimahullah. I mean, when you look at the background of, let's say, Sheikh Gavara, when you look at so many different, this type of people who have done so much in so little time, if I was to look at their reading lists, you can just kind of tell why they were there, who they are. I mean, this is, I can imagine, okay, somebody's reading, I mean, in our times also, I mean, you can look at somebody's book shelf and say, okay, I see where this brother is coming from. I mean, I see your your bookshelf and behind you, and so at that time, being black in America, access is very limited. And books were expensive. Fine, he gets some time when he's incarcerated. Was it enough for Malcolm to just have the time to think about things? Is what made him Sheikh, or was it access to the Quran? What happens to him, Sheikh? Because I'm trying to really understand, to connect it to today's, our people. For instance, we don't read. The Muslims in general, we don't read. I mean, so how important is that to understand that you don't have to accept oppression, like the way you were saying? Some people were just happy with having a meal at the end of the day.
Okay, yeah, you're correct. Muslims don't read today, unfortunately. Now, Malcolm did not develop out of a vacuum or void. Malcolm had a background. His father was a Garveyite. He was an activist. Okay, his mother was also a Garveyite. So they, Marcus Garvey.
I don't know what.
Marcus Garvey was the one who actually first came with the idea of Pan-Africanism. Okay, he was actually a Jamaican citizen, actually, and he traveled to London because London was actually a British colony. Jamaica was a British colony. So he actually had access to education in London, and he encountered a person there by the name of Dus Ali. Dus Ali was an Egyptian, and Dus Ali was actually a Pan-Africanist. But what Dus Ali's idea of Pan-Africanism was not telling the Black Americans or the people who come by way of the African diaspora to go back to Africa. Dus Ali was telling the Arabs that had went throughout Europe that you have actually abandoned your country, that you all need to come back to Africa. Okay, come back and rebuild Africa, So Marcus Garvey himself and Dus Ali had some form of a partnership in publishing. So Marcus Garvey come to America, and he actually replicated the idea of Pan-Africanism because he looked at the condition of the so-called Blacks in America at that time. And these terms like Black, Negro, colors, these are actually social classifications that was actually applied to those people because they had lost their ancestral descent. So, so they was actually an unidentified person. So only when they could get back to Africa, they could reestablish themselves with a legitimate identity. So all of the names that was applied to them in America was only synonyms for slave. At any level because how can you live in a democracy of equality for all people and have a distinct ethnic identity that calls you to be at the bottom of the social ladder of hypo descent? How could that happen in a democracy? So Marcus Garvey was saying if you get back to Africa, at least you would have a stronger footing. So Malcolm's father, Earl Little, was actually propagating the Garveyite philosophy. And that is why he was distinguished from the other Blacks in the area, Oklahoma and Nebraska and so forth, and Lansing, Michigan, because of the fact that his stance was to empower people of color. Okay, so Malcolm had and his mother had that form of orientation. So they all and Malcolm saw a lot of racism at his young age because his father had a direct encounter. So now Malcolm is actually absorbing this race energy from the society in which he's growing up in, and then he see himself being disenfranchised as a person of color. And really, Malcolm coming to his sister, okay, Ella Collins, right, who is the daughter of Earl Little. Okay, she herself was also an older sister and also a Garveyite. So they had this Black empowerment philosophy, and she was an educator and a real estate owner and so forth. So Malcolm was not a vagabond that people may perceive. He just went to the streets as an alternative, trying to escape his horrific life, his past that was chasing him. And he used drugs and all other things as people do when they fall into a state of depression. So now when he gets inside of the correctional facility, now he has an opportunity to what? To engage with other people that were in there, Garveyites, Moorish scientists, NOI people, Ahmadiyya Muslims. So he was in an education environment, okay? And they were
fancy institution.
Yes. So going to prison was like going to college. And of course, what Malcolm actually extracted from his reading and research, you didn't find in the regular books in America. If you read about slavery in the history books of America, it's a soft field. A few years, the Africans was just in the cotton fields. If you look at the civil rights movement, it was Dr. King was successful in getting America to change their views about people of color. You don't see the police brutality. You don't see the lynching. You don't see the clubs, the water holes, the dogs, the segregation and the psychological damage it is done to a whole society. You can't see that in the book. Okay. So what happened, Malcolm coming out of the prisons, joining the Nation of Islam was therapeutic for him. There was a way in which he could actually strike back from a legitimate platform, and he had an audience that was listening to him, and he could express himself. So the environment itself, of course, nurtured Malcolm, but he also was in an environment where these type of ideas was resonating. And Malcolm was just the one who picked up the mantle. He was charismatic. He had the right personality. He had the right background. He had the courage and the willingness to sacrifice. Okay. And that's what made Malcolm who he was, different from all the other civil rights and social justice activists.
Sheikh, you mentioned his home environment in the house like this. I mean, so that means around the dinner table, you're not discussing football or entertainment. You're discussing how do we change this world?
How to make the world better.
Right. So and these are daily conversations. This is the bread and the butter of where Malcolm comes from. So that goes into just another question. When we are looking at our homes today, and if you can just mention that, I mean, what should happen in our homes? I mean, how many Muslims even know Malcolm X that way?
Very few. I would say how many Muslims know El-Hajj Malik Shabazz? Right. And very few know Malcolm X, because in order to know Malcolm X, you have to know the backdrop. You have to know the climate. You have to know the culture that produced a Malcolm X. You have to understand why he was angry. And in fact, Malcolm was not angry enough to match the injustice that was levied towards people of color. Now, one of the unique things about my upbringing is that my father was the one who actually, he was the last one to pray for El-Hajj Malik Shabazz.
You're talking about Sheikh Hisham.
Yeah, Hisham. So, and what happened with that is that many people weren't aware that Malcolm was a Muslim. Even the Muslims weren't aware, because upon the Shahadah, August of 1964, less than a year, Malcolm was assassinated. 5 to 6 months out of the country, no one could engage with Malcolm. So they just knew Malcolm as the Black nationalist, possibly made the pilgrimage and could be a Muslim, but not sure. So, but my father, a part of that transitional team, knew that Malcolm was a Muslim. And he knew that if Malcolm went down as a Black nationalist, right, that we as Muslims would have did an injustice. Okay, so there was a risk factor attached to my father getting involved, stepping in that space and actually performing the janazah, because there's only 2 people there. And because the United Nations diplomats were given an executive order by the Justice Department, do not attend, do not give credit, do not give value to Malcolm. So what I'm saying is that my father transferred that information, that experience, okay, to his children, to his sons. Okay, so we are the recipients of that legacy of that culture. So we didn't have time to talk about football or basketball, or the Super Bowl, okay, or the World Series. We were orientated to actually preserve the legacy of Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz as a Muslim, to protect and to preserve Islam in its true context. And I say this, you see what, and I always say, I come from a different walk. Usually when you encounter a Muslim in America, usually he came through the Nation of Islam. He went through the transition. I'm Sheikh Muhammed, possibly got a scholarship that went to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or Morocco, and they come back with the correct understanding of Islam. But somewhere in their nurturing, they still have empathy and some affinity. Okay, and they give credence as though that is the cradle, okay, for the birth of Islam in America. I don't have reservations for setting the record straight, because I didn't come from that walk of life. I came from the Sunnah from the very beginning, and the Nation of Islam was always an opposition to us. We was always trying to make the correction. When Malcolm was preaching the theology of the Nation of Islam, my father was condemning him. My father was saying that's not Islam. My father was the gatekeeper to make sure that the eloquence of Malcolm's speech and his charisma did not attract those Sunni Muslims into that particular organization. And unfortunately, upon the demise of Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm, a lot of the Muslims, Sunni, lost patience, and they joined militant-based organizations like the Black Panthers. All of these are outgrowth of Malcolm. Okay,
the Black Panthers were formed right after his assassination. I never knew that. I thought it was always there for some reason.
No, there was no Black Panther organization until the assassination of Malcolm. There was no militant-style organizations. Okay, no Black until, and that's because they didn't have a what we call a spiritual or a religious foundation. They were more socialist orientated. Okay, so it was more about gaining. It went beyond just civil rights or getting what belongs to you. They actually wanted a political change in the environment. So they were selling the idea that socialism was more of a benefit than democracy or capitalistic democracy. I haven't seen democracy actually, blossom in the society. I call it a capitalistic democracy in that sense. So that came after Malcolm. So my father had to actually guard two gates. He had to actually prevent the Muslims from being pulled into the militant organizations and movements. Okay, we saw a lot of them ended up being incarcerated for life sentences because they had physical and encounters with police officers. My father, he did a lot of janazas for Black Panthers who were Muslims, who had gun battles with police officers and things like that. Retrieving them from prison when they died inside of prison, because that's a right that the Muslim hold over us, is that we have to pray their janazah for them, regardless of their circumstances and choices. So my father, and on the other end, my father was actually trying to stop the growth of the Nation of Islam. Now, if you come to my city, Elizabeth, New Jersey, and that's where my father had his community, his masjid and his center, you find very little NOI influence in the city.
Right.
Okay. Because of the presence of Islam. But the other places, they didn't have a lot of Sunni organizations. You go to Brooklyn, New York, you find very little influence of the Nation of Islam, because we had Sheikh Dawud Ahmed Faisal, Yarhamullah, who had the mosque at State Street. So where we had strong Sunni foundations, it impeded the growth of the Nation of Islam. And that's why I said in the beginning that the East Coast, right, had more Islamic presence than, a centralized Chicago and those areas like Detroit. Yes.
Sheikh, last question, I promise. You end the book with the ayah, وَجَاءَ الْحَقُّ وَزَهَقَ الْبَاطِلُ إِنَّ الْبَاطِلَ كَانَ زَهُوقًا. Why specific this ayah, Sheikh, to end the book?
I say that because the truth is yet not, I would say, known but accepted. The people who look at Malcolm, the people who still have some empathy and affiliation, whether it's emotional with the Nation of Islam, still have not come to terms, right, that Malcolm was a Muslim. Okay. And I think that once we recognize that Malcolm was a Muslim and what Islam actually is, then it would lessen the growth of the Nation of Islam. And I say this because what has happened is that when you have people who have influence over numbers and their Islam is questionable, okay? And of course, as a Sunni Muslim, we know what is Islam and what is not Islam. Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, we know what is Islam and what is not Islam. So what happened is, unfortunately, these people can just overnight say, well, I'm going to join the Muslims. I'm going to become the Sunni. Immediately, we put them in the front line. And they're not qualified. Okay, they have not made the sacrifice. So what happened is they get their cake and eat it too. Okay, so we have to make sure that there's a transition. Okay, that means you have to find your proper place in the ranks of the Muslims. Okay, that you just can't become the leader because you was the leader of a group in Jahiliyyah or in a non-Islamic movement. You just can't step right inside of Islam and you got the spotlight, because there's many elements that qualify you as a Muslim. And first and foremost is Iman and sincerity. Okay. And we need leaders that have integrity, that's willing to sacrifice, that's willing to speak the truth in the face of adversity, despite its consequences. There's a lot of qualifications that this person will have to exemplify before we embrace him as our leader. Of course, they can join the ranks and they can share. And see, that's one of the downfalls of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, is that upon the assassination of Malcolm X, their Sheikh Muhammed Ahmed Hassoun, who was from Sudan, who taught in the holy city of Mecca for 33 years, had to return back. Okay, so they themselves decided to try to navigate, okay, within inside of the borders of America as Muslim and build a Islamic foundation without the qualifications of knowledge, as opposed to dismantling that organization and joining the greater Muslim community, because Malcolm established that organization as an NOI affiliate, as he defected, but the theology was still consistent. So once Malcolm accepted Sunni Islam, it was just a matter of time before he actually assimilated and collaborated with the Sunnis across the board. So by them not joining the greater Muslim community, right, they dwindled. And the Muslim Mosque Incorporated became no more than a tabletop organization because the people weren't trained in Islam. And Malcolm himself said he was embarrassed being the leader, the imam of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and couldn't even lead the people in the prayer. So he recognized his limitation as an imam in that capacity, but of course his leadership was embraced. You know, his insight and vision was embraced. But he himself humbled himself to become a student of Sheikh Ahmed Hassoun so that he could better serve the people as a Muslim, not as a black nationalist. As he said numerous times, I'm not a racist. I'm not a racist. I'm not a black nationalist. I'm not a Pan-Africanist. I am a Muslim.
Subhanallah. Let's end it there, because that's the best way to end it on who Malcolm X was. Subhanallah. MashaAllah, Shaykh. Jazakallah khair. I think, to be honest, I think these two episodes, I hope those who are watching this episode and did not get to see the discussion that we've had, the previous one before this one on Malcolm X with our Sheikh, please make sure, brothers, that you click. Inshallah, we'll put the link to this one or the one before, so that you can go back and see where this whole conversation is coming from, because this is the second part. And also, brothers and sisters, subscribe. There's a lot coming up, inshallah, on these discussions. We are going to also have the Sheikh, at least we're working with him to see if he can come to Chicago December in the mid-December, inshallah, to talk about a conference that we're calling it, inshallah, we're going to call it Malcolm or Bilal to Malcolm. And we're going to talk everything between that's happening, that has happened from Bilal radiallahu anh to Malik Shahbaz, Malcolm rahmatullah alayh. Again, Sheikh, Jazakallah khair for all your time, all your efforts, all your books, all the knowledge. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to give you the tawfiq to do so much more, bi'iznillahi ta'ala. Questions. Yeah, and then, maybe one day what we might actually have to do that is gather all the questions that came through these discussions and answer them one by one. So we can just call it questions to the episodes or the answers to the episodes, inshallah. Because I think there's a lot of things that you've mentioned are very sensitive. And people probably want to know more. Inshallah Rabbil Alameen.
And I'm again, Sheikh, I'm open for a dialogue to discuss difference of opinion about certain information that I presented. I'm not the type of person to shy away from my research. If it's flawed, then I'm there for correction. But again, I was very forensic, very strategic, very careful to make sure that all the I's was dotted and all the T's was crossed, and that this information is actually public domain. Any person who, the hours that you have to put in it, of course, it may not be beneficial for the person, but it's all there, and it can all be actually revisited, and again, it's matter of now, is the text accurate? Because the information that has been inserted in it is actually accurate based on textual proofs, affidavits, trial transcripts, and also living persons, and also transcripts from videos and confessions.
Sheikh, Jazakallah khair. And dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.